Welcome to the channel, where we don't just report the news, we break it down so you understand what's really happening behind the headlines. This is your place for clear, sharp, and fact-driven analysis of global events. No noise, no confusion, just the truth. If you want to see beyond the surface and understand the real story shaping our world, you're exactly where you need to be. What if the word ceasefire gives us a false sense of peace, when in reality it is nothing more than a pause in conflict, waiting for the next trigger? Let's think about this carefully, because this is where language can be misleading. A ceasefire sounds reassuring. It suggests calm, stability, even resolution. But in practice, it is something far more limited. It is not built on trust, not grounded in reconciliation, and certainly not a final settlement. It is a temporary arrangement, an agreement to stop fighting, often because continuing the conflict has become too costly, too risky, or strategically inconvenient at that moment. And because it is based on calculation rather than genuine agreement, it carries within it the seeds of its own fragility. Now imagine this in simple terms. Two rivals are locked in a confrontation. They step back, not because they trust each other, but because both need time to regroup, to reassess, to reposition. The tension does not disappear, it simply becomes less visible. The conflict is not resolved, it is deferred. That is what a ceasefire represents. It is not the end of hostility, but a suspension of it. And that distinction is critical because it shapes everything that follows. Now consider what sustains such an arrangement. A ceasefire depends on restraint, on each side choosing moment by moment not to act in ways that would reignite conflict. But restraint is not a fixed condition. It is influenced by changing circumstances, by new developments, by shifting priorities. And when those factors change, the willingness to maintain restraint can weaken. Because if one side begins to believe that the agreement no longer serves its interests, or that the other side is exploiting it, the logic of the ceasefire begins to break down. Now think about the inherent imbalance in expectations. Each side enters a ceasefire with its own interpretation of what is acceptable and what is not. These interpretations are rarely identical. One side may view certain actions as permissible, while the other sees them as violations. And because the agreement is often not detailed enough to eliminate all ambiguity, these differences create friction. That friction may not lead to immediate collapse, but it creates tension beneath the surface. And over time, that tension accumulates. Now consider the role of time. Ceasefires are often seen as opportunities to negotiate, to de-escalate, to move toward a more permanent solution. But time can also work against them. As days pass, new incidents occur, new pressures emerge, and the original conditions that made the ceasefire possible begin to change. What was once a useful arrangement may start to feel restrictive or outdated. And when that happens, the incentive to maintain it diminishes. Now think about the psychological dimension. A ceasefire requires a degree of belief, not in lasting peace, but in temporary stability. Both sides must believe that the other will adhere to the agreement, at least in the short term. But if that belief is shaken, if actions are perceived as inconsistent or provocative, doubt begins to take hold. And once doubt is introduced, it alters behavior. Each side becomes more cautious, more suspicious, more prepared to respond. And in that environment, even minor incidents can escalate quickly. Now consider the broader implication. The existence of a ceasefire can create the illusion of stability, but that stability is conditional. It depends on continuous alignment of interests, on consistent restraint, and on a shared understanding of the agreement. Remove any one of those elements and the structure begins to weaken. Not immediately, not always visibly, but steadily. And because the ceasefire was never built on a foundation of trust, it lacks the resilience to absorb sustained pressure. Let me put it clearly. A ceasefire is not peace, it is a pause. A moment where conflict is held in suspension, not resolved. And because it is temporary by nature, it requires constant maintenance. Without that, it does not end with a clear break. It erodes, gradually losing its meaning until it becomes indistinguishable from the conflict it was meant to contain. And the question we must now ask is this: when we hear the word ceasefire, are we witnessing the beginning of peace, or simply the quiet preparation for what comes next? What if the real reason ceasefires fail is not because one side breaks them outright, but because both sides believe they are following them correctly? Let's think about this carefully, because this is where misunderstanding becomes instability. A ceasefire, by its nature, is often negotiated under pressure, shaped by urgency, and written in terms that leave room for interpretation. It outlines broad commitments: stop attacks, reduce escalation, maintain positions, but rarely defines every possible scenario. And in that ambiguity lies a fundamental problem. Each side interprets the agreement through its own strategic lens. What one considers a legitimate action, the other may see as a violation. And once those interpretations begin to diverge, the ceasefire starts to lose its coherence. Now imagine this in simple terms. Two people agree to stop arguing, but they never clearly define what counts as an argument. One believes that raising their voice is unacceptable, while the other believes that only direct confrontation crosses the line. Both think they are honoring the agreement, yet tension continues to build. That is exactly how conflicting interpretations work in a ceasefire. It is not always about deliberate escalation, it is often about different understandings of the same rules. Now consider how this plays out in a real conflict environment. One side may carry out operations it believes are defensive or limited in scope, perhaps targeting threats it considers outside the ceasefire's boundaries. The other side, however, may interpret those same actions as aggressive and destabilizing. From its perspective, the agreement is being violated. And because both sides feel justified, neither sees itself as responsible for the breakdown. This creates a dangerous dynamic where each action is both a response and a provocation at the same time. Now think about how quickly this dynamic escalates. A single action leads to a response. That response is interpreted as further escalation. And soon what began as a disagreement over interpretation becomes a cycle of retaliation. Not because either side intended to abandon the ceasefire, but because the shared understanding that sustained it has broken down. And once that shared understanding is gone, the agreement itself becomes difficult to maintain. Now consider the role of communication. In an ideal scenario, conflicting interpretations could be addressed through dialogue, clarified, adjusted, resolved. But in high-tension environments, communication is often limited, delayed, or influenced by mistrust. Each side may doubt the intentions of the other, making it harder to reach common ground. And without clear communication, assumptions take the place of understanding. Each side begins to interpret actions in the most unfavorable light, reinforcing the belief that the other is acting in bad faith. Now think about the psychological impact. Once a side believes that the ceasefire is being violated, even if that belief is based on interpretation rather than clear evidence, its behavior changes. It becomes more defensive, more prepared to act, more willing to justify its own escalation. And in that environment, the threshold for breaking the ceasefire lowers. What once required a significant provocation may now be triggered by a smaller incident because the sense of trust has already been weakened. Now consider the broader implication. A ceasefire does not fail only because of deliberate aggression. It can fail because of ambiguity. Because the lack of precise definition allows different narratives to emerge. And once those narratives diverge, the agreement loses its stability. It becomes less of a shared framework and more of a contested space, where each side argues not just about actions, but about what those actions mean. Let me put it clearly. The strength of a ceasefire lies not only in its terms, but in the alignment of interpretation. Without that alignment, even well-intentioned actions can be perceived as violations. And once perception shifts, reality follows. Because in conflict, it is not just what happens that matters, it is how it is understood. And the question we must now ask is this: when two sides believe they are both right, yet continue to move closer to confrontation, is the ceasefire failing because of actions, or because of the way those actions are being interpreted? What if the collapse of a ceasefire is not a sudden event, but a slow, almost invisible process that unfolds step by step until the agreement no longer has any real meaning? Let's think about this carefully, because this is where expectations often fail to match reality. People tend to imagine that ceasefires end with a clear moment, a declaration, a major strike, a decisive break. But in practice, that is rarely how it happens. More often, a ceasefire erodes gradually through a series of smaller actions that on their own may not seem significant, but together undermine the entire structure. It is not a dramatic collapse, it is a quiet unraveling. Now imagine this in simple terms. Think of a structure built on a fragile foundation. It stands firm at first, appearing stable, but small cracks begin to form. At first, they are barely noticeable. The structure still functions, still holds together, but over time, those cracks expand. More appear, and eventually, the foundation weakens to the point where the structure can no longer support itself. The collapse, when it comes, seems sudden, but in reality, it has been developing all along. That is how ceasefires fail. Not in a single moment, but through accumulation. Now consider how this process unfolds in a conflict. A minor incident occurs, an isolated strike, a limited operation, an action that one side justifies as necessary. The ceasefire remains in place, but the incident introduces tension. Then another action follows, perhaps in response, perhaps independent. Again, the ceasefire is not officially broken, but its credibility is slightly reduced. Each step adds pressure, each action tests the boundaries of the agreement, and because none of these steps alone is decisive, the overall structure continues to exist, even as its integrity weakens. Now think about how perception changes during this process. At the beginning, both sides may still believe in the value of the ceasefire. They may see these incidents as exceptions, as manageable deviations. But as the frequency of such actions increases, that perception shifts. What was once seen as a stable agreement begins to feel uncertain, and uncertainty changes behavior. Each side becomes more cautious, more prepared to respond, more inclined to interpret actions as part of a larger pattern. Now consider the role of normalization. As incidents continue, they become less surprising. What once would have been seen as a serious violation becomes something expected, even routine. And once that happens, the threshold for what constitutes a breakdown rises. The ceasefire still exists in name, but its meaning has changed. It no longer prevents conflict, it merely limits its intensity. And that is a critical shift because it transforms the agreement from a tool of stability into a framework for managed tension. Now think about the strategic implications. Each side may continue to operate within what it considers acceptable limits, but those limits are constantly being tested and redefined. And because there is no clear moment of collapse, there is also no clear moment of decision. The ceasefire fades rather than ends. It becomes less relevant, less effective, less central to the actions being taken. And by the time it is formally declared over, if it is declared over at all, it has already lost its practical significance. Now consider the broader impact. This gradual erosion creates a sense of inevitability. Observers begin to expect further escalation. Markets react, diplomatic efforts lose momentum, and the space for de-escalation narrows because the trust required to sustain it has already been weakened. What remains is not a stable pause, but a fragile state where conflict can intensify at any moment. Let me put it clearly. The collapse of a ceasefire is not an event, it is a process. A series of small steps that, over time, lead to a larger outcome. And because that process is gradual, it can be difficult to recognize until it is well advanced. By the time the collapse becomes obvious, it is often already complete in all but name. And the question we must now ask is this: if a ceasefire can disappear without a clear ending, how do we know when peace has truly begun, or when it has already quietly slipped away? What if, in modern conflict, the most powerful messages are no longer delivered through diplomacy, but through carefully calculated actions on the ground? Let's think about this carefully because this is where communication itself has changed. In theory, nations communicate through official channels, statements, negotiations, agreements, diplomatic talks. But in reality, especially during periods of tension, those channels are often supplemented or even replaced by actions. Strikes, warnings, troop movements, and strategic signals become a form of language. Each action is not just a military decision, it is a message. And that message is directed not only at the immediate opponent, but at allies, adversaries, and the global audience watching closely. Now imagine this in simple terms. Instead of speaking directly, two sides begin to communicate through gestures, each one carefully chosen to convey intent, strength, or warning. One side takes a step forward, the other responds with a step back or perhaps a stronger stance. Neither may explicitly say what they mean, but the message is understood through action. That is exactly how strategic signaling works in modern conflict. It is communication without words, or at least without reliance on them. Now consider how this plays out during a fragile ceasefire. When trust is limited and interpretations differ, direct communication may not be sufficient or may not be trusted. Instead, each side uses actions to reinforce its position. A strike may be intended as a warning, signaling that certain lines cannot be crossed. A public statement may accompany it, but the real message is in the action itself. At the same time, the other side may respond with its own signal, perhaps a threat, perhaps a demonstration of capability, intended to show that it will not be deterred. And in this exchange, communication becomes a cycle of action and reaction. Now think about the risk inherent in this system. Unlike words, which can be clarified or adjusted, actions are immediate and often irreversible. A strike cannot be rephrased. A movement cannot be reinterpreted once it has occurred. And because each action carries consequences, the potential for miscalculation increases. What one side intends as a limited signal may be interpreted by the other as a broader escalation. And once that interpretation takes hold, the response may go beyond what was originally anticipated. Now consider how this affects the stability of a ceasefire. Strategic signaling can undermine the very restraint that the ceasefire requires. Each action, even if intended as controlled communication, introduces tension. It tests the boundaries of the agreement. And when these signals become frequent, they begin to replace the ceasefire itself as the primary mode of interaction. The agreement remains, but it is no longer the main framework guiding behavior. Instead, behavior is shaped by the exchange of signals, each one pushing the situation slightly further toward escalation. Now think about the broader implications. Strategic signaling does not occur in isolation. It is observed, analyzed, and interpreted by others, by allies, by neutral parties, by global markets. Each signal contributes to a larger narrative about stability, risk, and intent. And that narrative influences decisions far beyond the immediate conflict. It affects diplomatic efforts, economic expectations, and international perceptions. Now consider the psychological dimension. When communication shifts from words to actions, it creates a more intense environment. Actions carry weight. They demand attention, and they often provoke emotional responses. This can make it harder to maintain restraint because each signal is both a message and a challenge. And in such an environment, the space for de-escalation narrows because stepping back may be perceived as weakness rather than prudence. Let me put it clearly. In modern conflict, communication is no longer confined to negotiation tables. It is embedded in actions, visible, immediate, and often ambiguous. And while this form of communication can convey strength and intent, it also increases the risk of misunderstanding and escalation, because actions, unlike words, leave little room for adjustment once they are made. And the question we must now ask is this: when nations begin to speak more through actions than through dialogue, are they still communicating, or are they moving closer to a point where communication itself becomes conflict? What if the true stability of any ceasefire is not written in agreements or enforced by power, but exists only in the fragile space of perception and trust? Let's think about this carefully, because this is where the fate of any temporary peace is ultimately decided. A ceasefire may be negotiated through formal channels, outlined in clear terms and supported by external actors, but none of those elements can sustain it on their own. What truly holds it together is a shared belief between the parties involved that the agreement is still worth maintaining. That belief is not fixed. It evolves with every action, every signal, every perceived violation. And once that belief begins to weaken, the ceasefire itself begins to lose its foundation. Now imagine this in simple terms. Two sides agree to pause a conflict. At first, both believe the other will respect the agreement, at least for a time. That belief creates a sense of predictability. Actions are measured, responses are controlled, and the environment becomes relatively stable. But then something changes. An incident occurs, a signal is misinterpreted, or a decision is made that raises doubt. Even if the agreement remains technically intact, the perception of it begins to shift. One side starts to question whether the other is still committed. And once that question is introduced, trust begins to erode. Now consider how quickly this erosion can spread. Trust is not a static condition. It is dynamic, constantly reinforced or weakened by events. A single perceived violation may not be enough to break it entirely, but it creates a crack. Another incident follows, and the crack widens. Over time, these cracks accumulate until the structure of trust becomes unstable. And when that happens, behavior changes. Each side becomes more cautious, more suspicious, more prepared to act in its own defense. And in that environment, the ceasefire becomes less of a guiding framework and more of a fragile understanding that could collapse at any moment. Now think about the role of perception in this process. It is not only actual actions that matter, but how those actions are interpreted. One side may believe it is acting within acceptable limits, while the other sees those same actions as clear violations. And because perception shapes reality in conflict, these differing interpretations can have real consequences. If one side believes the ceasefire is no longer being respected, it may feel justified in responding, even if the agreement has not been formally broken. And once that response occurs, the cycle of escalation begins. Now consider the psychological dimension. Trust allows restraint. It gives both sides the confidence to avoid immediate reactions, to interpret events with some degree of patience. But when trust is lost, that restraint disappears. Actions are viewed through a lens of suspicion, and even minor incidents can trigger significant responses. Because without trust, there is no buffer, no space for uncertainty, no tolerance for ambiguity. Everything becomes immediate, and everything becomes a potential threat. Now think about the broader implications. A ceasefire that loses trust does not simply end, it transforms. It becomes a hollow structure existing in name but not in practice. It may still be referenced, still acknowledged, but it no longer shapes behavior. And once that happens, the risk of open conflict increases dramatically, because the mechanisms that once contained it are no longer effective. Let me put it clearly. The strength of a ceasefire is not measured by its terms, but by the level of trust that supports it. Without trust, even the most carefully negotiated agreement cannot hold. Because agreements do not enforce themselves, people do. And people act based on what they believe, not just what is written. And the question we must now ask is this: when trust disappears and perception turns uncertain, is a ceasefire still a barrier to conflict, or merely the illusion of one?